Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and I'll be your host today. And my guest is Kat Rosenfield, who most Blogging Heads watchers and listeners probably know from her show Feminine Chaos. I'll ask her to introduce herself in any additional ways that she wants to.
Sure. I'm Kat Rosenfield. I am a freelance writer and, as Aryeh said, a co-host of Feminine Chaos here on Blogging Heads with Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, who unfortunately could not join us today.
Right. So, okay, so the loose topic for today is, does Twitter matter? And a lot of these thoughts from the back of my head, but the last episode you did with Phoebe kind of made me want to talk to one or both of you about this topic. And you had a discussion about this. I guess we should briefly summarize it. There was a viral tweet that I think it was a comedy writer, or at least a woman who writes in a comedic vein often, was saying basically like if you go home with a guy after a first date and he does not have a bed frame, like that's a major red flag. And you should probably get out of there. Is that right?
Yeah, it was it was even more in-depth than that. It was, if you don't have a bed frame, it means that you've never been in a relationship with a woman long enough for her to fix your life.
Right.
So this meant that you had been previously so undesirable. The bed frame represented a lot more than just not having a mattress on the floor. Right.
And I had coincidentally just put a bed frame together right around the time I was listening to this, so it struck home to me.
Thank God.
Yeah, and it's an annoying, if you're putting it together yourself, it's an annoying task. But anyway, it did, and then this went viral, and it may have even been like a Twitter moment or something, which is when Twitter highlights something and shows like all the replies so more people can see it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people were replying like, right on, you go girl kind of thing, and saying like, yeah, that makes total sense to me, or I dated a guy who didn't have a bed frame and he was a serial killer. And then there was like a backlash. There's a backlash of people being like, I grew up in poverty and I was like, digging ditches for a living for 20 years and I couldn't afford a bed frame. And how dare you imply that like I didn't have my life together? Or you can imagine all sorts of other things like, I'm a little person and I can't climb up into a bed that has a bed frame. And this is like,
lots of mentions of like also dogs, like large arthritic dogs who can't jump, or small dogs who don't have great hops. Consider the dogs also. This was a very discriminatory tweet against dogs of all kinds.
Right. So you guys analyze this and I kind of tore into the original conception of it, and it just made me think like, this is like a perfect thing that happens on Twitter and wouldn't like, this expression probably would not happen absent social media, because it's so kind of like, you can imagine like a stand-up comic maybe saying something like this, but it wouldn't go viral absent the the social media part of it. And yeah, it just like, it made some people very happy because they were like, yeah, this chimes with my life experience. It made other people feel like they were being disrespected or, erased, or they weren't being seen or something like that. Their experiences weren't valid, and that everyone's fighting each other. And the original tweet continues to get more, pushed up in the algorithm, and more people follow the woman who originally tweeted it, and then eventually it like flames out, and the next thing happens. I was thinking that, like, is it like, does this have any real world analog? Like, is this like just sort of this, are there people out there who are really concerned about bed frames, and like, did the original woman, really care about bed frames, or did she just come up with a clever idea that would be like a single joke in a stand-up set? And all the people who are expressing like great offense at this because they couldn't afford a bed frame for 15 years until they saved up and finally purchased that first bed frame, but they still had like a very meaningful like relationship with a woman during that time. Like, were they really outraged about all this, or is this all like kind of just a performance? And you have these, weird people who spend a lot of time on Twitter, and I include myself among that group of weird people. And we are not like the average Americans who are going about their days, like getting things done and, picking up their kids from soccer practice and stuff like that. Like, we are like thinking of funny things to write on Twitter for some reason. And So is this all just like, I don't know, I don't even know how to describe it exactly. It's like an epiphenomenon or something. It's like doesn't like, it's a wisp that doesn't truly exist. So what do you think about this?
I don't know. You may have answered your own question like several times in that entire spiel. I mean, the thing about Twitter is obviously, not everyone's on it. At the same time, it is sort of a microcosm for larger trends, social trends, discussions that are happening, in all kinds of spaces. And so I think, like you were saying, this thing about the bed frame, sure, it feels like a bit. It feels like something that, you'd see somebody talking about on stage. The fact that it's instead being talked about on social media introduces this interactive element into it where, people are not just inclined but encouraged to take it much more personally. And that includes the people who are like, I went home with a guy who turned out to have no bed frame and, he tied me to the radiator and beheaded me. And, it's incredible that I'm typing this now because I'm in fact dead. But then also, invites the opposite reaction of people who read this and feel judged, rightly or not, and are like, you're painting with a kind of a broad brush here to say, that it's a red flag for a person not to have a bed frame. Isn't this classist? Isn't this ableist? Isn't this biased against small and large dogs? And of course, all of the taking it personally is what fuels engagement. So I think, oh boy, here comes the cat. Yeah, bed frames not biased against cats. They can jump very high onto anything. So, but when you ask the question, does it matter? I think because Twitter represents such a particular collection of people, the average American is not on Twitter, but the people who are on there overwhelmingly are people who kind of set the tone for culture, for what gets talked about. Journalists, comedians, artists of all kinds, politicians, and if the
president of the United States.
Yes, exactly. So, and imagine that you had an actual physical space in which all of those people were all spending a significant portion of their day interacting with each other, sometimes getting into fights, but overall, there was a lot of conversation happening there. If that were a room or a clubhouse and someone said, but does what happened in this space really matters? You'd be like, yes, of course it fucking matters. It's full of the most influential people in the country all talking about the stuff that the rest of us end up talking about because they talked about it first. Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, it certainly matters what happens on Twitter.
Yeah, and that's an interesting metaphor of the clubhouse. It reminds me of a previous metaphor I've heard, which is that Twitter is kind of an infinite, middle school cafeteria, where you have all these little groups and they're all talking to each other, but then people can overhear each other's conversations sometimes, and then something that was happening in one group can jump to the other group. So the people who are just talking about a show on the CW network that they really like, but then someone says something really wild, and then that thing can hit the stand-up comedian table and the politics table and the media table, and now everyone in the cafeteria is talking about it at the same time, even though it was just the CW network fan table to begin with.
Yes, yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's akin to one of my favorite metaphors about Twitter, which is that it's like writing on a bathroom wall, but everyone is writing on the bathroom wall. So similar dynamics. Middle school always enters into it, though, which is funny.
Right. Okay, so another aspect of it that I wanted to bring in, and this is a very lame thing to do, but I'm going to read an old tweet of mine, because I think it does encapsulate this. And yes, this is a tweet. I tweeted this a year and a half ago. One thing Twitter has taught me is that when people get mad, they often prefer to stay mad instead of getting less mad. And so you often see people who, outrage is a very popular thing to do on Twitter. And then there's some point where they can calm down, or obviously they can just stop tweeting and leave and go do something else. But they have an off ramp or something. Someone apologizes. It seems like, okay, we can call it on this one and move on to the next thing. And instead, people are like, that apology wasn't good enough. And here are the 7 reasons why that apology wasn't good enough.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. The bulleted lists of why the apology wasn't a good enough apology is, I mean, and absolutely amazing. Like if anybody ever makes a museum of, of the discourse circa right now, the reasons why I'm not accepting your apology because it didn't satisfy me is going to be just like an exhibit of its own.
Right. So I think most normal people, if they were angry, like once that initial like surge of emotion began to fade, they would not like seek out other things to make them angry. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think that like online, the type of person who ends up on Twitter and then the dynamics of Twitter itself encourage this staying mad kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I want to put a pin in that. The type of person who ends up on Twitter and who does this, because the people who disengage like a normal person, who are like, cool, like, oh, it's just a misunderstanding, I'm going to go outside now. You don't see that. That never comes across your timeline. Like you might happen across it by accident, and then usually there's always one person who did that who's like, wow, it was really refreshing to see this fight not happen because everybody involved is a normal person. But Twitter is a place where, especially in certain kind of sub-communities, I think amongst people who spend a lot of time online and for whom Twitter is actually maybe a primary, if not a sole, social outlet, you want to stay in that space, and a lot of the time that means staying mad. And this idea of somebody like finding reasons to reinvest in their anger, that's something that people also do in real life because they have personality disorders. And I mean, not to be flippant about it, but that's a real life thing. It's just that when you do it offline, face to face, it does not make you popular. People tend to start to walk away from you because, nobody wants to be around that. The dynamics of online are just so flipped that this very antisocial behavior ends up in a lot of cases being rewarded, I think.
Yeah, that seems true. And so part of it is this, there was an academic finding, actually, I tried to find it before we started taping, but I couldn't find it quickly, but I'll see if I can find the link, that looked at what makes a tweet go viral. And one of the key parts of it was like emotionally charged language. So you could tweet something like, ate at McDonald's today wasn't very good. And that's the tweet. So no one's going to care about that tweet. And then you can tweet something like, ate at McDonald's today and it was the worst fucking meal I've ever had in my life. I almost jumped out the window and threw myself into traffic. So that's more likely to get some engagement on the platform than the original tweet. And this goes in all sorts of, politics is a very obvious place where this goes, where there's constant outrage on both sides. And, the resistance type people are always looking for like some new fact about Russia or something to get angry about, and some of these facts are real and some of these facts are don't really pan out, and it doesn't matter. And then the MAGA people are always looking for some insult that someone did to Trump and how awful it is, and Trump definitely plays into this. But it's just most just like being a highly like emotionally reactive, like like you said, this is kind of an indication that you're not in a really healthy mental state if you're ready to fly off the handle at because your McDonald's meal wasn't so good or whatever happened, and like this really does, the McDonald's meal I just made up, but like the kind of customer service interactions that happen where someone on one side of it, it's like African American customer is treated rudely by a white employee, and maybe the other side of it is like these things that where like in Starbucks a cop orders a coffee and the barista writes pig on it, although I think most if not all of these have been proven to be hoaxes, and just
there's one real one and then one hoax.
Okay, so the fact that someone would hoax this just is part of the whole maelstrom of trying to get attention online. But you just like the most outrageous emotionally charged thing is going to get you attention because that's what gets people riled up, and then they hit like or fave and retweet, and then it goes viral, and then you feel good for some reason about it.
Maybe you feel good. But no, I mean it's so like one of the things that you kind of like circled in that piece of the conversation but didn't quite land on is that it's not just about negative language, but if you can find a way to kind of lay claim to the cachet of victimhood online, that is going to play really, really well.
Right.
I'm outraged. It's like something bad was done to me, and it's even better if you can identify the person who did the bad thing. Twitter loves a target. And I think that that's, maybe an important part of this too. But again, the president is a great example. President, for better or for worse, is really good at Twitter. And that tells you something about Twitter, probably.
Yeah. And then, the flip side to that is that extreme positive emotion can get you, as it doesn't always have to be negative, extreme positive emotion can get you attention. You see a movie, this is the greatest fucking movie I've ever seen in my life. Stan culture, everything Taylor Swift or Beyonce does is perfection. You see these tweets about the this Korean boy group that is called BTS. That's it's roughly the equivalent of Backstreet Boys in Korea, except they're 10 times as popular. And
we just left my line of cultural knowledge base somewhere way in the dust. So you're gonna have. I
often, if there's a trending topic that I don't know what it means, I often click on it just to satisfy my curiosity, and it's often about the kind of dramas of the world of K-pop, because a lot of I think the answer is a lot of South Korean teenagers tweet in English on Twitter, and so you have. This one is broke up with this one, and so this one fainted on stage, and you just and people were pledging their life to them, and then there's the whole, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, run me over with your car kind of thing, or right. You're just expressing a devotion to someone in the most insane, wacky way, and even though that some of that is tongue in cheek, it's just that's an extreme emotion, and people wouldn't have been saying that 20 years ago about whatever their cultural heroes were at that moment, and that's the kind of stuff. It just it doesn't raving about something and saying it's the greatest ever will get you attention as well, because that is emotional language also. Mm-hmm. So why don't we? Okay, so that provides a transition point to the Oscars and something that you wrote about.
Wait, we've successfully skirted the fact that you're obviously a super secret closet K-pop fan. It's just research. I just got curious. No, I'm
you click once because you're curious and you're like, wow, these guys have some really good dance moves, and they're very handsome, and so the Oscar nominations came out earlier this week, and I think what's interesting about them. So there's been an ongoing theme the past couple of years about how many white people, what a high percentage of white people are nominated, and men in the technical and directing and writing categories as opposed to women, and so. And then it's just the fact that the Oscars are pretty lame, and Green Book won last time, a movie that no one under the age of 50 enjoyed or saw or anything. I didn't see it, and. So, but people have been complaining about how lame the Oscars are, for as long as I've been paying attention to this. But I did notice that the conversation on Twitter was not, so there wasn't that positive, hooray for whatever, hooray for whatever person, Martin Scorsese got, his 15th nomination or something. It was all outrage about who didn't get nominated. And especially people of color or women who didn't get nominated. The director category was all men, even though I didn't see it, but lots of people are saying that Little Women is a very, very well-directed movie by Greta Gerwig. And then, before we go on to your article, what did you think about that, reaction of how people took it?
Well, okay, so I want to plug a favorite writer of mine. Her name is Sasha Stone. She has a website called Awards Daily. She has been covering Oscar chatter since before anybody else was doing it. She's been doing it for 20 years. When she started her website, I don't know, it was Geocities in 1999 or something like that. So she has a great analysis of why the outrage over Little Women not getting a directing nomination for Greta Gerwig, why that's fake news. And I found it very, very compelling. She really knows her stuff. She outlines the entire history, with due acknowledgement to the fact that, yes, historically, the Oscars, and particularly the directors category, has been a major boys' club. There have been, I guess it's something like 6 women in history have ever been nominated for a directorial Oscar. It's insane.
Mm-hmm. And maybe only one winner? Catherine Bigelow?
Yeah, Catherine Bigelow. Yeah, she's the only one. It's nuts. And there's absolutely, to try to claim that sexism doesn't have something to do with that is a completely bonkers argument. Clearly it does. That said, Little Women, is one of these movies that my dog has strong feelings about this too. It's one of these movies that the kind of media, and particularly like the take media, the feminist media that that fuels so much of like the most clicky stories online, really coalesced around the narrative that this was the best movie ever, and in a way that goes against what actual popular reaction to it was. It's not that it was an unpopular movie or that people didn't like it, but it's arguably just not as well made as a lot of the other films. And this was a really big year, or 2019 rather, was a really big year for really, really good movies. And that if you take a step back and you kind of look at the landscape and you look at Little Women in terms of like how it was directed, some of the choices that she made as compared with something like Jojo Rabbit or 1917 or even Joker, the quality is just not the same. And that if we weren't all so incredibly invested in the kind of like outrage culture that's going on right now, where we want to sort of seize on a narrative of unfairness every year, that people would be maybe a little bit more, I don't want to say complacent. That's not the right word, but it's failing me. They wouldn't be freaking out about it the way they were. Mm-hmm. So that's, I haven't seen Little Women yet. I will eventually, although as a child of the 90s, I have pretty strong feelings about the 1994 version with Winona Ryder. That's always going to be my version. But I'm open to it. But yeah, I think the thing is, like, people have gotten into the mode of getting mad about the Oscars. And this year, the piece that Sasha Stone wrote actually does a really great job of kind of just putting up, like, on screen, in a way that you can really see it, how in the bag, say, like the New York Times was for the idea that Little Women was going to like win all the awards, in a way that set up an ongoing outrage narrative to continue when it didn't get nominated. Uh-huh. So it's really interesting to see how that.
Okay, we'll link to that article below this video on Blogging Heads TV. Yeah, that's interesting. And I actually did not see that many movies this past year, so I didn't see any of the ones that I didn't see Little Women, Joker, 1917, or Jojo Rabbit yet. So yeah, like I said, there's it's not a surprise that like the people, like the kind of the popular consensus as to what was a good movie does not end up being the Oscar nominee or winner. Like, it's often like this is just like such a running joke that who really, really, really liked Green Book, and are people in 10 years going to be like looking back on Green Book as a masterpiece of 2018 cinema? I kind of doubt it. I didn't actually see it, because who cares? But
minor detail.
But
clearly enough people liked it that it made it into the categories, and then B won the award. So
right. And there's also all these, like, perhaps the woman you mentioned, goes into this kind of stuff. Like, this is not like a pure artistic achievement award. Like, there's all these politics that go into it. Whose turn is it? Who deserves it? Sometimes the acting awards go to people who are in like a later stage in their career, who were, didn't get an award in the earlier stage in their career, in which they did. They gave better performances because people say like, oh, it's time for so and so to get it. And there's a sentimental favorite kind of thing. And I'll just, who knows, maybe someone is like, it's an open secret in Hollywood that person X is an asshole, and, no one likes him. And so we're not going to vote for him, even though he did a really good job, playing a comic book villain or something. I just made that up. I don't know anything about Joaquin Phoenix being
a lot.
An asshole.
A lot goes into it. A lot goes into it.
And then the other irony is just like, why people get outraged. People indicate outrage on Twitter. Who knows whether they're really truly outraged about this like musty thing that like everyone agrees is like very compromised by all sorts of things that are not just artistic merit. And then it's like our favorite person didn't get nominated for the shitty award. Like, should we be mad that they didn't get nominated for the shitty award, or should we be like, there's like Avengers Endgame people out there who thought Avengers Endgame should have got like a Best Picture nomination or something like that. Like, it made $1 billion. Like, isn't that enough for you people? Like, comic book movies rule the land now. But like, I don't know, but yeah, so the Academy generally does not acknowledge special effects extravaganza type movies. They did with Lord of the Rings, the third one, and maybe a couple others, but mostly that's not the kind of thing they're into. And so it's like, I don't know. I mean, there's so many awards out there, all these ones you never think about until like you hear that so and so won the New York Film Critics Circle Award or whatever it's called. And then there's just like 50 of these award ceremonies that happen every year, and they all go like, it's not always the same thing, and most good movies get some sort of recognition, and then like, I don't know, it's on to the next thing. But yeah, I think I just thought it was noteworthy that I didn't see anyone celebrating. I just saw people outraged about snubs. There was no one being like, hooray for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's going to do it this year. People were like, no Awkwafina nomination. How dare you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's just sort of how the conversation is framed. I mean, my only Oscars tweet was a positive one, and it did not honestly get a whole lot of engagement. I'm just in the bag for Klaus as Best Animated Feature Film, and it's probably not going to win because Toy Story 4 will win. But it's a really sweet movie and beautifully
See, I did see that tweet, and I think I watched a little bit of the of what you embedded in there. So what is that film? Because I never heard of it before.
It's a Christmas movie. It's an animated Christmas movie. It's on Netflix. You have what's that guy's name? He was in Rushmore. The Jason Schwartzman, yeah, voices the main character, who is a sort of a rich kid who gets sent to be a postmaster in this like middle of nowhere island that is dominated by two warring clans of people who have like an old family grudge. I don't remember what the origins are. And Joan Cusack is one of the voices of like the matriarch of the family. And anyway, to not make this too convoluted, it becomes an origin story for Santa Claus coming down chimneys and bringing children toys. And the Santa figure is voiced by J.K. Simmons, which is just like so good. But I mean, just like, as an animated film, which, I don't watch a ton of, but have gotten a little more into since I started getting into comic book stuff. It's just like the quality of the art is really beautiful and really different, which is something that you saw awarded at the Oscars when they decided to give it to Into the Spider-Verse, which was like also very well deserving, also really looked different. It was just like, we've seen Pixar's style, and it's cool to see things kind of like branch out. Beyond that, also beyond the sort of flat two-dimensional, like the DreamWorks sort of look that, I think we all got used to in like the late 90s, early 2000s. Anyway, Klaus is a good movie. I highly recommend that everybody go watch it. It won't take you very long. And, yeah.
And it's in the full length. It's not the short.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's like 90 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'll check it out. Okay. So why don't we talk about the piece that you wrote, was it for what? It was a British outlet that you wrote.
It was the U.S. version of The Spectator.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the background, which you can fill in, has to do with Stephen King.
Stephen King,
renowned horror writer, writing some tweets about he's part of the Academy. And, about his votes this year.
Right. So he wrote two tweets, which he made the mistake of not threading. Not that it necessarily would have mattered, but it didn't help. The first one was noting that, yes, he's an Academy member. He was in a position to vote this year. He only gets to vote on, I think, like 3 different writing categories. So he wasn't really in a position to influence the diversity discussion one way or another. That was tweet number 1. He said, that said, I would never consider diversity. Actually, I should make sure that I'm quoting him correctly. I'm going to look up this tweet. I'm going to try to look up this tweet. to make sure that I got it right. But what he said was essentially that he considers quality over diversity. And people got very, very upset about this. Okay, I would never consider diversity in matters of art, only quality. It seems to me that to do otherwise would be wrong. And people, of course, got very upset about this. Everyone was like, I always used to respect you. And then some people were more like, I wish the van that ran you over in 1999 had backed up and done the job, finished the job. Typical Twitter behavior.
Yeah.
He had weighed in on this, and I think that a lot of the outrage honestly stemmed from the fact that he said out loud what a lot of people think but realize they're not supposed to say out loud. But what I wanted to write about was partially the predictability of this, Stephen King is as left-wing as they come. And the idea that he's now the enemy of, the politically progressive coalition on Twitter is just so bonkers. I mean, you couldn't find a better example of people on the left eating one of their own, and for what? What's the point? But also when he says that, to consider diversity ahead of quality, or to consider anything but quality would be wrong, he's making a moral argument that I think people are not engaging with and that they maybe should engage with, because what he's expressing is something that's fundamental to the values of a lot of liberal people, who are not prepared to just trade in this moral center that they've grown up with, something that they hold dear and that, is really fundamental to how they conceive of what is good and how to be a good person in the world, in favor of what's being pushed by some people on the progressive left, which is this very sort of identity politics, inflected version of a belief system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess a few thoughts on this. Why is Stephen King tweeting? He has written, he's one of the most prolific and successful authors of, the second half of the 20th century, continues to have bestsellers. Does he need, why, and he must be, 75 years old or something at this point. Why is he, on Twitter? Someone needs to tell him, just, stick to the books and, the things that make you money.
He likes it. I mean, he must like it. Also, he uses Twitter a lot of the time. I follow him, and he is constantly popping up in my feed, poking at Susan Collins, who he's trying very hard to get ousted in the upcoming election. I think she's up in 2020 for re-election. He wants her gone. So, he's a political presence on Twitter, among other things.
Okay, so he's not just sharing his thoughts of the day or something. He's trying to get something done. So that makes some sense. I guess the other reaction is he kind of framed this in a way diversity and quality. And the way he set it up was kind of and he was thinking of it about as an affirmative action sort of thing. There's the movies that reach the quality threshold that they deserve to be celebrated. And these are mostly made by white people or feature white people. And then there's the movies that don't quite measure up to the quality level of the Oscars, and these are made by people who aren't white. And some people would vote for the ones that aren't as good because the people who made them aren't white, because for various reasons one can imagine doing so. I don't think that's so that's kind of maybe somewhat akin to university admissions or something, where you have a student who isn't quite up to the normal level, and is a racial minority, and then you give him or her a boost or something like that. And this continues to be controversial in America, but this is basically how it's done. And I don't think people I don't think that's the right frame to apply to this. You have movies that are made by established people, and because of the way the system is, the established people are mostly white men, and they mostly make movies about white people also, and then you have some people working within the system, some people working outside the main system who are making smaller movies, the Awkwafina movie. What is it called? The Farewell or something, which I did not see, but got very good reviews. And then that like that's not like they want a leg up. It's more like they're doing something that's a little different from with what would normally come out of the system. Like that movie, The Farewell, like 90% of the dialogue is in Mandarin and is subtitled, but it's an American movie distributed in America for American audiences. So they're doing something different.
The Chinese did not like it. I think, kind of a key point there. They felt that it was insulting.
That's interesting. So that's taking a risk. I didn't see the movie, so I don't know if I would think that it paid off, but doing something different. And so that's not like, oh, let's give this kid from the inner city whose SAT scores are 100 points lower, like a boost or something. It's just like, this is something different. And maybe the old white people who constitute the Academy, they kind of want the same thing they've mostly gotten, which is like, movies by white people, about white people, or movies like Green Book, in which like the racial narrative fits into these like certain like tropes, that evil word of, like the black savior teaching the white person like about what racism really means or something like that. So I that was my objection to it. It was like, if he like thinks that there's a bunch of movies out there that are made by non-white people and they don't quite measure up, then like that is kind of like moving towards like a kind of racist belief, because that doesn't make sense to me that like people of non-white races can't make good movies. You can see how they can be locked out of like the system, the Hollywood system already, but
I think that's sort of, that's where it kind of comes in, is that, overwhelmingly the people who are in the upper echelons of Hollywood, it's like Hollywood is like the Ivy Leagues. It's not a diverse place in terms of who's successful there, and you have all of these family dynasties and people with influential friends or relatives, people who come from wealth. By the time you're in a position to be honored at the Oscars, like you're already in the 1% basically. So the idea that it's, any kind of a surprise that the people that you see on that stage tend to look a certain way and come from a certain background, obviously it's not. I think that your interpretation, or at least the one that you ran with just now, of King's tweet is probably not as charitable as he deserves, especially because he stepped up afterward and pointed out that, when he thinks about diversity, the issue is, you want to get rid of the gatekeeping that happens beforehand that keeps these filmmakers out of, say, the studio system. You want them to have the opportunity to make the art several steps back so that it can then be considered come awards season. At the same time, there's also an argument to be made that, let's not focus so fully on awards season. And the Oscars especially, it's like one tiny little slice that, that matters. Yeah, I mean, it matters, but, not to the main movie-going public. It doesn't determine what films make money for their creators. It doesn't, there's not the be-all and end-all of whether a person gets to make another movie. So, there's more to consider there. I think that what King is getting at is, at the point at which you're sitting down to evaluate the films that are available, and it's like 60, it's like 60 movies. It's a not inconsiderable task to watch and form an opinion about each of them. That, he is just going to watch them and decide what he thinks is good and what he thinks is bad. And there's not going to be a point at which he says, well, I wouldn't have voted for this one, but the filmmaker is black, so, nominated. And it's hard to imagine, honestly, that if he said that out loud, that people would think it was really super great. I think that basically what people want is just for him to, to keep quiet, because I think what he's doing, what he describes himself doing, is basically what everybody does. I mean, at least in all likelihood, but they don't want it highlighted. particularly not by somebody who has like a bajillion followers on Twitter and a lot of clout in literary circles. And not somebody who looks the way that Stephen King does. There was obviously, predictably, the response to him was a lot of like, shut up, old white man. You're pulling the ladder up behind you, which, that of all things is really that's not a fair criticism of Stephen King. Like, say what you want to about him, but he's definitely done a lot in his life and in his career to, help other writers and writers who don't look like him, get a leg up and succeed. So.
Yeah. And if someone said, especially a white person, if they were like, well, I watched Queen and Slim, is that what that movie was called? Mm-hmm. It's called. And, I thought it was kind of mediocre, but I voted for it just because the cast is black or the director is black or whatever. Like that kind of, racialized thinking would garner its own backlash, and like there's people who think both ways. I'm sure privately, there's just like support black-owned businesses. Like that's a kind of thinking in terms of race that like is fine with me and most people. Maybe there's some people who would object to that kind of thinking, and you could be like, well, this store I go to like isn't as good as some other store run by some other type of person, but I'm just going to keep going there because I want someone who maybe had a harder lot in life than me to succeed. But then when it comes to the great Oscars, the things that we say, this is the greatest thing. This is the movie that is the greatest of the year.
It's
different.
The illusion, at least, of purity, I think, of like, we're not, we're honoring the best of the best, the cream of the crop. And it's like this spectacle, there's the glitz and the gold statues and everyone's swanning around in their $5,000 gowns, with like $6,000 of injectables in their faces. They all look 25, even though many of them are in their 60s, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think, maybe what, part of it is that it just like it's the whole package. It's supposed to feel a certain way. It's this idealized thing, and when people pull back the curtain on it in these various ways, some people feel that it ruins things.
Right. And yeah, just like I'm kind of reiterating myself, but like the Academy has so many biases that go into it. There's a certain type of movie that is the Academy movie.
I just remembered something that I think is worth pointing out. So, in light of all of the criticism that it's come in for recently, the Academy actually did last year, and they made a big noise about this.
Right, yeah.
They introduced 842 new members, half of whom were women. Lots and lots of of marginalized people from marginalized communities, women and people of color, and unfortunately, like I think, for a while, at least until the initial entry bar is a little bit different and allows more and different people telling more and different kinds of stories through, what you're going to find is overall, despite their respective identity categories, Oscar voters are still going to have a kind of a shared idea of what a quality film is. And then you cannot rely on people to vote, for instance, for a woman director just because they themselves are women. It just doesn't work that way.
Right. And just to just complete my thought, the Academy likes a certain type of film. It's usually like a historical drama much more is like the category that they seem to overpraise more than anything else. There's not that many comedies that ever win Best Picture. And I'm just Googling the Best Picture winners from the past 20 years. Like, there's some duds in here. I mean, Crash is an infamous one. Argo.
That's the one that makes me angrier than anything else.
Argo, which when I saw was just a perfectly fine, average B movie, but it was like, for whatever reason it won. Like, are people still really watching Chicago, the musical from 2003? Like, I don't think I've watched that since it came out, and I think I joked on Twitter when people were doing their best of the decade in film list. I said the best film of the decade is Children of Men, which came out in 2003, because I still think it's one of the best movies ever made. I don't think that movie received any Academy recognition, and it was the same year, I think, as Chicago. And so that was the kind of, they wanted like like people tap dancing and Richard Gere like doing flips or whatever it was, as opposed to like an actual like interesting movie that like is resident for me 15 years after it came out.
Well, I mean, the Academy's tastes are always reflective of what's happening in the country at large. So Chicago would have been like that came out in 2002. That was like a year after 9/11. So, you've got, I think, you get like a mood happening. I'm now looking at this thing like, 2010, The Hurt Locker, that's like a war movie that, is fairly gritty, directed by a woman. What was happening in 2010 that made it possible for that to become a front runner? Like, who knows? But then again, like in 2013, you had Zero Dark 30 up for Best Picture. And for whatever reason, even though there were, a fair number of women in the Academy at that time, they voted for Argo anyway. It's just one of these things where it's like, what dictates the tastes of the people who are making these decisions? It's, a whole lot of different things.
Yes. And, I guess the other thing maybe the last thing I would say about this is like, this is not the Olympics. It is not like we can say, oh, this person ran the fastest and they should get the medal. Like, this is all subjective. It's art, it's movies. The argument continues forever, whether something is good or not. And just because the Academy says it's good, as I said, Crash was good and Argo was good and Million Dollar Baby was good, doesn't necessarily mean it's actually good.
I thought Argo was good. I don't know. I mean, when I'm looking back at like,
it wasn't the best picture I saw that year for sure.
That's okay. We're allowed.
But maybe they wanted to give it to Ben Affleck.
That's different tastes. Well, I mean, he'd already won the best screenplay for Good Will Hunting, ages ago. But when you look back at like the past 10 years, like last year was Green Book. Before that was The Shape of Water, a fantasy about a woman who has sex with a fish.
Yes, that was very surprising. But in some ways, that was like it's Guillermo del Toro's turn to get the thing.
Granted, the fact that he didn't get it for Pan's Labyrinth, I think, was considered an outrage.
Yeah, it's not unusual for the thing that is best in a movie maker's career to be ignored, and then the something later on is
what did Scorsese win for? It wasn't his best thing, was it? Was it like?
That's a good question. Did he win for? I'm looking. I'm not seeing. Yeah, maybe. Has he won Best Picture? Maybe he hasn't.
He won for The Departed, of all things.
Okay.
I mean...
And that was the same thing. People were like, well, The Departed is fine, but, like, is this... this isn't as good as Goodfellas and Raging Bull and Taxi Driver.
Exactly.
Okay, so the Oscars suck. I think we can both agree. Okay, so let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to say on... about Twitter, our original topic, before we wrap up. I mean, I guess, like, there's just part of it that's, like... What is weird about Twitter is you have like the elite in some sectors, like the President of the United States, politicians, media, celebrities. Who knows if celebrities really pay attention? And then you just have this, the seething masses of normal, more or less people who don't have any public platform who are on there, and those are the type. And so when there's like a pile on, it's not usually like 50 media folk like piling on. It's like one media folk will like retweet something. And then, like, their, like, normal person followers do the pile on. But then, like, what kind of psychopath spends time on Twitter? One must ask. And like I said, including myself in this, so it just, like, it is weird that things that, like, things that go viral on Twitter especially, can tend to shape events because of the way the like user base of Twitter is set up with so many media people on there, so things travel from the Twitterverse into the actual real mediaverse somewhat more easily than like happens on Facebook, even though like 2 billion people are on Facebook and like normal quote unquote people are on Facebook.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about Twitter, too, is that journalists, I think at this point it's safe to say, are really over-reliant on Twitter as a medium for sourcing stories, which is why in like the past 10 years or so, we've gotten this plethora, like every time, an outrage happens, it'll be like, you'll have 6 stories in major outlets that are like, people are boycotting the new Star Wars because they can't handle there being a black stormtrooper. And then you go and you look for the source of this story, and it's 3 anonymous people on Twitter who have like 12 followers each. Yeah. And there, I think, becomes a question of, are journalists who are using this as an easy way to, to find a kind of a clickbaity story about an outrage happening, are they actually creating a monster so that they can then write about it and other people can go fight it? There's, I mean, it's almost like a moral question, or an ethical one. Are you doing the right thing when you create a phenomenon out of whole cloth that then maybe becomes a thing only because you made people believe it was to begin with?
Yeah, I can see that. And anything, I think possibly the tide has shifted on this cheap tactic of plucking 5 people from Twitter to makes that this is an article that like BuzzFeed or something would have done. I mean, they still do shit like this, but I feel like people are like,
they just did it. They just did it with this thing about Zoomers calling Gen Xers Karen, the Karen generation. It's not happening. I mean, I guess it is now because thanks BuzzFeed.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe BuzzFeed is still doing this, but yeah, I mean, it should be embarrassing at this point, like to be doing that kind of shit and just searching for plucking tweets out. It's like plucking a fish out of the ocean or something and saying that this is a representative fish. Like there's just, there's some number of people who are regular Twitter users. I'm not sure what that number is. I think it's probably much smaller than Twitter wants us to think. Like maybe it's just a few million, and then you can find some weirdos in any group, and then the Twitter group is more likely to have weirdos in it than like the man on the street kind of thing that the reporter would just like walk down the sidewalk and ask, say, can I ask you a question about something to get a regular person's opinion? Like, yeah. And then just adding like in the performative aspect of it is that like, this is not the reporter asks you, what are your thoughts on the new Star Wars? It's like someone who feels the urge to tweet out their thoughts because they get something out of that, either like self-actualization of seeing their words on the screen, or they can get like likes and retweets and clout and so forth by taking whatever position. So yeah,
probably a negative or extreme one, because that's how you spiral. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we should end things there. Is there anything else you want to say about Twitter? Would you? Okay, here's one last thing, and you can say whether you agree or disagree with this. In the past couple months, multiple people who are not on Twitter ask me if they should get on Twitter, and I always say no. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I try to spend less time on Twitter than I did, say, last year. And, every time I'm not on it for a while, I always feel like my life is better. So, yeah, agreed. There's really no reason to hang out there unless you're really good at it, in which case there's no reason to hang out with you.
Okay, that's a good final word. Thank God I only have 2,400 followers and haven't cracked the code yet. Okay, so Kat, thank you for coming on. So Feminine Chaos is your show that you co-host with Phoebe Maltzmovie on Blogging Heads. There's also a Patreon that has bonus episodes and other content. And what's the URL for that? It's
patreon.com/feminine chaos. Yeah, even more chaotic.
Makes sense. So people should check, if you haven't listened to Feminine Chaos, check it out, and then maybe you'll even want to become a patron of Kat and Phoebe. Okay, so thank you, Kat. Thank you to our viewers and listeners. We'll see you again next time.